be a bit misleading. Okay, I'm Johanna Marcussen and I'm a PhD student at the University of Agder, where I collect data on recreational fishing for the European lobster. And I'm also a stock assessor, trying to deal with the lack of data or the abundance of data. And some of the species, or most of the species that I work and assess, they have one thing in common, and that it is that they are data limited to some extent. So they all fall into the category 2 group within the ICES framework. So they're data limited to some extent, but there's still enough data to run an assessment using biomass models. Another thing these species that I work with have in common is that they're coastal and have some recreational component, which is largely unassessed. And in Norway, we have we have more than 1.3 million recreational fishers. Just to put it into perspectives, Norway has only 5 million inhabitants, pretty much the same as Cape Town City. So we have a high participation rate. At the same time, we have some of the most liberal rules. We don't have a registration system except for lobster and tuna, and there's no mandatory reporting of recreational catches unless you sell them. So there's quite a few stocks that have where the recreational catch component is missing. Okay, so this is one of our cooler time series. This is the commercial catches of the European lobster. So it runs back to the 1820s, and in the 30s we were in the lead in Europe when it comes to exporting catches. It's quite cool and impressive to have such a long time series, but in after the 60s, the commercial fishery was no longer economical viable, and this beautiful time series is no longer representative of the total catch. We're lacking the recreational component the last years. And we're using surplus production models to assess the European lobster. And one of the assumptions of the surplus production model is complete catches. So what do we do when we don't have recreational catches? I'm not talking about poor data, I'm talking no data. And we still have to run an assessment. Should we just ignore it and wait for better times? Better data? Or should we try to estimate it or approximate the catches with some uncertainties? Also, if we're ignoring it, or if we're accounting for it, it's a golden opportunity to introduce recreational fishery into the advice, flagging the issue, either the data or the lack of a management plan for the recreational sector. So I'm going to show 3 examples where we have included recreational fishing catches into 3 data-limited stocks using the frames that we already have. So starting with the Nephrops fishery, the Norway lobster. It is a funky fishery. So it's spatially segregated with 2 different fleets. There's a trawl fleet operating out in the deep sea, and then there's a pot fishery going on in the coastal areas. The pot fishery is a combination of recreational and commercial fishers. And I call them recreational fishers, but this is truth with some modifications. They are quite similar to the commercial. The only difference is the number of pots they're allowed to use. So the recreational fishers are allowed 20 pots. And for the Nephrops, we don't have any numbers, no estimates whatsoever on the total harvest rates. So we came up with an assumption. And as Karen said earlier today, when you're making models, you get used to coming up with assumptions, and then we'll test them later. So we came up with the assumption that the recreational catches are around 25% of the commercial pot catches. And when we ran this and tested different scenarios, so here's to the right you have the relative biomass, and to the left you have the relative fishing pressure. And the different colors are different scenarios of how large the proportion of the recreational catches is. So since they're quite small compared to the commercial, only 6%, but still with some variation over time, it has very limited effects on the relative trends. But important, the catch advice includes recreational catches. We also, I forgot to mention, but we also included, so in SPICT you could choose to include your catch data without any uncertainties and assume they're the true catch data, or you could include some observational errors, and we done that with Nephrops fishery to scale it to the proportion of recreational fishers to the commercial. Okay, moving on to the less data limited, the halibut. So here there's still we don't have any registration for the total catch from the recreational sector for the halibut fishery. The halibut fishery is even more funky. It's very mixed. So you have the commercial sector fishing with long lines, gill nets, and trawl, and then you have the commercial sector fishing with gill nets, long lines, rod. You have tourist fishing and spear fishing. So there's a jolly mix. But still no catch estimates for recreational halibuts. So we came up with an assumption that there was a ratio of 1 to 4 with recreational catches to recreational sold catches. Yes, we're allowed to sell our catches. Then this assumption was based on a study within this assessment units in a small area. And is it good? Is it bad? Well, it's an assumption. Okay, so same figures. You have the relative biomass on the right and the relative fishing pressure on the left. Here, the recreational catches are a bit larger than for the Nephrops, but it still has very limited effects on the relative trends, both for the biomass and for the fishing pressure. A little bit more for the biomass. There's a lot of uncertainties. We also included observational error on the catches of the recreational fishing component here. But again, the recreational catches are a part of the advice. This is our national advice for halibut. And when the quota was agreed on, there were a small part that were allocated to the recreational fishers as an unaccounted component that is not managed, but it's still allocated. So for the data-rich one, the European lobster. So in 2020, we had a probabilistic survey where we got relatively good estimates of total harvest from the recreational fishers, and in one of the regions, they account for 90% of the total catch. So the assumption here is we don't have any historic reference points, but we still reconstructed the catches back in time, creating a bunch of different scenarios back to the 60s. We tested different scenarios running further back with different, similar to what Kieran showed earlier, like linear increase, exponential increase to the level that we see today or in 2020, where recreational fishers are catching 90%. And then we fed this one into the assessment, and it has a huge impact on the relative trends because of, it's quite obvious, but since the recreational fishers are dominating the fisheries, this is just for the south coast where they are catching 90%, but also on the west coast they're catching 80%. And so the state of the European lobster is currently an overfished stock that are still being overfished, mainly by the recreational. We don't have an advice yet on this one, this coming. Okay, so to sum it up, it's quite as expected. And it aligns with the experience from category 1 assessments. It is the relative scale and the time variation that matters. But it matters. Even if the effects are marginal, it matters to include the recreational catches. The model were better, performed better. It's also a way to future-proof the assessment. So when better data are available, you're already ready with the recreational component implemented into your framework. And also, again, the representation in the advice. Flagging an issue. Okay, we're lacking data, so we need more resources for collecting more recreational or better recreational data to improve the advice. So I would like the main take-home message is just do it. Some reasonable assumptions tend to be better than nothing, but I'm not crazy, or maybe a little bit. But solid data-driven approaches are, of course, preferable. But still, this is our take on trying to use the framework we already have and highlight that we need more data or flagging the issue of recreational fishing in stock assessment for data-limited species. So happy to take a bunch of questions. I think I'm ahead of time.
Thanks very much, Johanna. I've actually got a quick question for you. Not really related to your talk, but more related to the anomaly that is Norway, where recreational anglers are allowed to sell the catch. And I'm curious, do you think that incentivizes, is that the rationale, the reason that you guys have such a high participation rate? Do you think it's used by certain people? Do you think it is affecting your participation rate?
Maybe for some of the fisheries, for the brown crab fisheries, there's quite a high participation by recreational fishers that are selling their catches, and they're calling it their quota. So for some of the fisheries, yes, but probably not for all of the rod and other fisheries.
It's very interesting. Yeah. Anyway, any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much for nice presentation. Did you try to see some kind of biological studies, like for instance on the maturation, like instead of just predicting the in order to fill this long-term data series, just instead of just predicting those things, I hope there might be some kind of biological studies on each of the species, like for instance in 1990s some on maturation, in size at maturity something. Then if you compare with the recent studies, they might be some kind of, they may be used as some kind of indicators for overfishing, or is it your prediction is supported with this kind of studies or not? Like,
so we mainly used, for these 3 species, we only used the biomass models, but we tested length-based indicators and length-based methods for the European lobsters, for instance, which is slightly taking into account what you're asking for. But there's also, for instance, for the European lobster, there's been a change of minimum landing size for the more than 200 years we've been fishing. So that's also influencing. We have length data back 100 years back for the European lobster, where we could track overfishing, for instance, based on length. But
yeah.
Okay. Did it answer your question?
Yeah.
Good. Time for one more short question. Yep.
I really enjoyed your talk. It's great and really interesting to see how you're trying to include stuff in data-limited methods as well, because that's a big gap in the stuff that we're doing. I'm really interested in how this is going to end up into advice, because one of the kind of key things that we always get pushback is on the uncertainty, and I'm kind of intrigued to know what whether you've had any feedback from the people that are going to be providing the advice, and then into the management about how they might use what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't had too much feedback, and for the Nephrops, for instance, it's so small that it doesn't really make a big difference. So I think it's maybe wise to start with some of the ones where the recreational harvest is a smaller proportion of the total. But yeah, that's definitely an issue. But I think being transparent with using sensitivity analysis, showing that it actually hasn't too much of an impact on the advice itself, is one of the most important things we could do in this.
Thanks very much. You're off the hook.